took the rejected stone and made him the cornerstone of a movement that's going to change the whole wide world.
This week saw the funeral of George Floyd, the unarmed black man killed by police on the streets of Minneapolis. Now, America already seems to have been changed by his death, with protests still ongoing and new legislation making its way through Congress. So in this episode, we're going to speak with Representative Maxine Waters about the political effort to reform the police, and with our very own Alzo Slade, who has been reporting from the streets of Minneapolis. Maxine Waters is the representative for California's 43rd District and has been at the forefront of efforts for police reform since the 1970s, including in the aftermath of the LA riots in 1992. She's also former head of the Black Caucus, and in recent years, one of Congress's most outspoken critics of President Trump. Representative Waters, thank you for joining us.
I'm delighted to be with you today.
So I'm just going to jump right in. I know you're very busy. You recently tweeted, George Floyd cried out, "I can't breathe." In his dying moments, he called for his mom. Black moms all over America must be struck with the realization that this could have been their unarmed black son being killed by a murderous cop. As a black mother, do you have to have this conversation with your family?
Oh, when my children were younger, we certainly did. My son, we have to have the conversation with them about what happens if you're stopped by a police officer, because so many young black unarmed males in particular, women too, but males have been killed by the people that we pay to protect and serve, or beaten, or framed even. And so I've gone so far as to work with others to print up cards with instructions that they should carry in their pockets with them, so that it teaches them, to make sure that their hands are visible at all times, to make sure that they don't talk back to them and anger them and give them an excuse to beat up on them. And this is pretty regularly done by mothers in the African American community.
Let's talk a little bit about the Justice and Policing Act. It was put forward by Karen Bass, Senators Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, Congressman Gerald Nadler. They've introduced the Justice and Policing Act, which is an approach to hold police accountable and change the culture of law enforcement. Can you unpack it for us? What are some of the attributes of that?
Well, let me first talk about what I think is one of the centerpieces of it, and that is the chokehold. The chokehold is used, in police departments all over this country. And even though some cities have said they're banning it, the police use it anyway, and there are no penalties for it. It was popularized here in Los Angeles with a police chief named Daryl Gates. And in a period of time, in about 4 or 5 years, they had used it and killed 16 people, and 12 of them were African American. I started on Daryl Gates, and I organized, and I went to the police commission, and I organized a lot of Black women, and we marched in front of the headquarters, and I wrote editorials, and I did a lot of press, but I kept on him. And out of that, the chokehold and the battering ram that he used. He had this long steel arm on it and something on the end of it that would break down doors. But that was work that I was involved in, helping to get rid of the chokehold and the battering ram, and to confront him about his racism and about the way that they basically brutalized young Black men. At that time, he also popularized arresting them, making them get out of their car in their Sunday best or whatever, and lying flat on the ground, legs spread wide open, arms spread wide open. These were his tactics, and he was one of the worst police chiefs we ever had.
So speaking of that, since 1992, just when you were joining Congress, you've seen the history from Rodney King till now. What's changed?
What has changed is the acts are still perpetrated against people of color, against poor people, in particular, people living in public housing, etc. For me, what has changed is we haven't had the organized effort like was done in the civil rights days, where they confronted, a violation of their basic human rights, where they were able to get the voting rights bill, where they were able to eat in public places and get the accommodations that had been denied. And so we did not have the organized effort. We didn't fight hard enough, I don't think, in order to try and get, the federal government more involved in terms of the civil rights, violation of civil rights. And so I don't think we fought as hard as maybe we could have or we should have. And I just think that we didn't have any change for the better, so-called, that it was still there. And still now, as we talk, young Black males are being brutalized on the streets while the protests are going on. But we've also had a killing, and I've also gone back to think about some of the investigations that have been going on for almost 2 years that have not been resolved. One young man who was shot in the back 6 times, and that investigation has not been resolved. And so it's still going on.
You've said, and I'll quote you again, is there a brave member of Trump's cabinet who would move to initiate the 25th Amendment to remove him from office? Now is the time to save our country before this would-be dictator takes us all down. A, is that possible before November? And if not, how important is the electoral cycle come November?
Well, there are a couple of things. I think when you have such a problem as the President of the United States, who talks about pulling out the military on peaceful protesters, you have to keep the conversation going. You cannot recede in the way that you talk about him and get others to think about him. Amendment 25 may not be possible. It may not be reasonable to even ask, but you got to do it. I'll keep raising things about him in ways that will make people think. And so the Democrats are focused on getting him out of office. We've got to get him out of office to save this country and to save the democracy. And so we've got to work hard. We've got to make sure that we can beat him in the electoral states. And that's what we're doing. We're working it.
We talked to former Attorney General Eric Holder about the importance of this election. And he said, he echoed your sentiments. He said, look, our democracy is at stake.
People of this country need to understand something. Now, I'm not an alarmist, but our democracy is on the ballot in November.
If November is so important, how do we get the vote out, especially for young people?
Well, first of all, I really do believe that the President of the United States is assisting us in getting out the vote.
Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
And those protesters that you see on the street, those are our voters. Many of them are our new voters who will be voting for the first time, and they're going to turn out. We're on our way now. We're on our way, and I'm so appreciative as I watch them grow and get involved politically.
So the protests recently have been the largest since the assassination of Martin Luther King. Is this a catalyst for change? Is this a springboard? Can we finally fix these wrongs?
I see change in the air. I really feel it. I really feel it. Let me tell you what convinces me more than anything else, that change is on its way. It's in the air. I've never seen so many whites on the street with Blacks and Latinos and Asians. And in some of the protest areas, you had almost 100% whites out there. I've never seen these kinds of protests in some of the southern states. Who would have thought that Texas had one of the biggest rallies and protests of any state? I've never seen anything like that. We've never seen anything like that in the United States. And so I think something is happening.
Time is out for you making excuses.
I think that this legislative package that we're putting together, that we have put together, that it's going to be fought very hard. And I don't know how far it will get. I don't know how much trouble we're going to have with McConnell and the Senate. I don't know if it will ever get to the president's desk. I don't know if the president will ever dare sign it. But that does not matter, because they cannot stop the movement now. And that movement will realize itself in the elections, where we will have a progressive movement that is created because of what I see happening now.
Maxine Waters, thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
I want to reach for my phone and record, but I know if I reach for anything, then I very well may get shot.
We're in Minneapolis, Minnesota right now, in the middle of a protest over the death of George Floyd.
Alzo Slade is an Emmy Award-winning VICE News correspondent who's just been on the ground in Minneapolis. Now, we don't normally interview our own people, but Alzo has done some of the most important reporting from the protests and was also detained by police despite displaying his press credentials. Alzo, thanks for joining me.
What's happening?
But one of the reasons why I wanted to interview you is I watched what you were doing in Minneapolis. I watched your coverage, and I was so blown away that I'm like, look, I want to interview this guy. It doesn't matter that he works for me or anybody else. I think it's just amazing what you guys did on the ground.
We're pressed. We're pressed.
Can you just tell me what it's been like to be a reporter in Minneapolis in this past week?
It's been interesting because when I first started working with VICE, I used to joke, but there's much seriousness in jest, that I was not a war zone correspondent. If I had to wear a flak jacket or a helmet, that was not my story. And unbeknownst to me, I would find myself in a war zone in my very own country.
At the end of this street, there's a wall of cops.
And so it was a bit surreal. And, you know, not only just as a journalist, but as a black male journalist, you know, on the front lines covering this thing was a bit surreal.
You are in violation of unlawful assembly. You continue to obstruct, resist, and/or interfere with peace officers. You will be violating Minnesota State statute.
How does it feel to be a journalist in your own country, covering a story, and they arrest you?
Okay.
Put this hand behind your back. You stand up for me?
I can try.
I mean, it sucked, but I've been handled like that by the police before. It wasn't anything that was unusual for me. I think when it, comparatively speaking to, you know, with reference to what we were there covering, I would consider, you know, being roughed up by the police a bit and walking out of there with my life and my breath still minimal, right? Because what we're covering is the killing of black men at the hands of the police, right? And so if a couple reporters get roughed up by the police, of course, with regard to freedom of the press, that's egregious. But with respect to what we were there covering, is minimal.
I am press. Please.
So when you're talking about, I don't want to go to a war zone, I don't want to wear a flak jacket, but yet you're covering domestic politics and it's like a war zone where you fear for your life. What's the ontology? What's the metaphysics that's going on in your mind?
It's kind of out of body, if you will, because in the back of your mind, as I said before, as a black man growing up in America, it's not the first time I feared for my life in front of the police. Being in that situation during the protest, I was concerned more for the folks that were with me, right? Because it wasn't just me by myself. And as a journalist, I want to reach for my phone and record. I want to be able to document this myself, but I know if I reach for anything but what they tell me to reach for, and that's the sky, then I very well may get shot. For me and my crew, which consists of 2 other black men, it was do what the hell they say, or what you fear may come to pass.
We're pressed, sir. Pressed.
When I was watching your interaction with the people you were talking to, there was a lot of honesty, raw honesty that came out of your question.
We gotta get violent. That's what makes them scared. If that what makes things change.
Do you think that because of what's happening in America, we're finally having the discussion that we probably should have had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
Absolutely. Yeah, we should have been having these conversations for quite some time. But I think a lot of people say these conversations are difficult to have, and they're difficult for different people for different reasons. They're difficult for white folks because it makes them uncomfortable. It's difficult for black folks because we're tired of having them, right? And so there's a group of people that had these conversations 10, 20 years ago. It didn't take. And then another generation comes, and then they recognize that we still have racial problems. Then we have to continue to have the conversation. But at this point in 2020, you see clear video, and we're in the middle of a pandemic where people are home and all of they're doing is watching television. And so you get this combination, this gumbo of events and circumstances that make it ripe for people to go out in the streets and speak loud because they're pissed off at what they see. And a lot of people were tired of talk. And that's why you saw what we saw in the streets when we went to Minneapolis. Because they're like, we ain't talking no more.
Over here, we have people that are breaking into a bank, which seems to be the antithesis of what the spirit of this demonstration is supposed to be.
But here's the problem. We've had many periods of discord, of protest, but we still have the same problems. And what I've been talking to people on this show about is, okay, if we don't use COVID, if we don't use what's happened in Minneapolis, if we don't use what's happening in the world today as sort of a springboard for change, then it's just another news cycle. Is this the catalyst for change, or is this another news cycle?
From what I saw on the ground, it's the catalyst for change.
The man who lives in this house, he's not doing his job. And so, you know, when we don't do our job, what happens? We get fired. We get fired, so he needs to go.
We're already seeing some change happening in Minneapolis where, you know, the city council has made it a requirement to stop any police officer that they see engaging in excessive force, right? They made the chokehold illegal. But the problem is the changes that we're seeing now are the changes that we should have seen 20 years ago. The leadership expects accolades and expect the people to kind of simmer down after they give them what they should have given them 20 years ago. And so in that respect, it may be a news cycle if the people in the streets don't have a strategy to go beyond marching in the streets, right? Because you can't be in the streets every night for the next 5-6 months to 2 to 5 years, right? And so one thing that we have seen is people transitioning, using that energy that they had in the streets and taking it to the ballot box. To the young people, don't think this shit is over. We got a long road. We're gonna need you to tighten up.
Do you think we need kind of a sledgehammer to shock us? I mean, as an environmentalist, humans don't like to do anything unless there's a gun to our heads. And now we're sort of finally waking up a little bit. Do you feel that that's the same with civil rights in America right now, that we're finally waking up to the real questions and we're looking at it in a real way?
I think we are looking at it in a real way, but it's the beginning of it, right? This is right now we are in the middle of the emotional reaction to it. And I don't think emotion has the power or the juice to take you the distance. You have to have willpower after the emotion leaves, because it's work. This shit is a marathon. It's gonna be a lot of work, and emotion won't carry you there.
What do we need to do now to go forward in 2020 in a positive way? Where should it go?
What I'd like to see is that passion in the streets transition into some very tangible strategic moves that don't necessarily have to be seen. above ground. There are organizations, there are folks, I think when you speak of millennials and Gen Zers, they've woken up. Like I spoke to some folks in the street, some young people in the street, and I could look in their eyes and tell that after this protest movement is done, they're not finished. And so with the younger people, they're starting to recognize that voting does matter, and not necessarily on the federal level, but on the city level, right? The local level, people are starting to wake up to understanding that the things that directly affect them are happening right up the street at the little community center where they have these meetings that only gray-haired folks go to.
From what you've seen on the streets, from your reporting, you know, talking to all these people on all sides, what's your message to all the kids who are watching today? What would you say off the record, which is now on the record because we're on camera?
To the young people, don't think this shit is over.
No justice! No peace!
We got a long road.
No peace!
We're gonna need you to tighten up. We're gonna need you to educate yourself on finances, educate yourself on educational leadership. You don't have to wait for somebody to teach you, because we have all the resources at our disposal right now that generations prior didn't have. And that's why we used to subscribe to one or two leaders like Dr. King or Malcolm X. But right now, there's a wealth of information out there, and you don't have to have an upper middle class background or upper class background to access it, right? So don't subscribe to the one leader model, because that one leader is within. So tap that joker and get your ass out there and continue to fight.
Alzo, on that note, thank you very much. You're an awesome journalist. I'm just proud that you're on the VICE team.
Glad to be here.